The
You
invitation
didn't
was a
think I would
joke,
miss this, did you?
literally.
It can't be
Marcus
you.
Hale, senior partner,
Surprise.
Sterling and Vale, slid it across
speechless.
the break room table with 2 fingers, the way you'd slide a napkin to a waitress. His voice carried just enough volume for the whole floor to hear. Send one to Vivian, too, the quiet little mouse in admin. He smiled at the cluster of colleagues around him. Let's see what she does with a black tie gala invitation. She'll either not show up, or she'll show up in something from a charity shop and remind everyone why some people stay behind desks. The laughter that followed was quiet, comfortable, and utterly convinced of itself. If this story moves you, stay till the end, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The elevator opened onto the 43rd floor at 7:52 in the morning, and Vivian Hart stepped out carrying 2 coffees, a manila folder, and the particular silence of a woman who had learned a long time ago that drawing attention to herself at Sterling and Vale rarely ended well. She was 38. She had worked at the firm for 6 years. In those 6 years, she had sat through 11 all-hands meetings without being introduced, processed contracts worth north of £400 million without receiving a bonus, and been mistaken for a temp by no fewer than 3 visiting executives, one of whom she had, at that precise moment, been briefing on quarterly risk compliance. She set one of the coffees on Nathan Sterling's desk before he arrived, the way she always did. Black, no sugar, temperature just below scalding. She knew this because he'd mentioned once offhandedly that he couldn't stand coffee that had cooled down. He hadn't said it to her. He'd said it to someone else while she happened to be in the room. But she remembered. That was the kind of thing Vivian Hart did. She remembered things nobody thought she was paying attention to, and she made the small machinery of other people's lives run smoothly and invisibly, and she was thanked for it roughly, never. The folder on Nathan's desk that morning contained 3 flagged contract discrepancies she'd caught at 11 the previous night. She'd stayed late. She usually did. She left a yellow sticky note on the top page. Clause 14B. Amended without authorization. Recommend legal review before Thursday. She didn't sign it. He knew her handwriting. She was at her own desk, coat still on, when Marcus came in. Marcus Hale was 45, expensively dressed, and possessed of the particular confidence that belongs to men who have never once been told their instincts were wrong by anyone whose opinion they respected. He was not technically her supervisor. He was, however, very good at behaving as though he was. He dropped the envelope on her keyboard without stopping walking. Gala invitation, he said. This Friday, Sterling's 30th anniversary dinner, the Dorchester. She looked at the envelope. Heavy cream stock. The Sterling and Vale crest embossed in the corner. Am I supposed to be there? She said. He paused at the edge of her desk partition and turned around with a smile that was generous in shape and entirely empty in content. Of course. The whole office is going. A beat. Well, the relevant people. He walked away. Vivian picked up the envelope and turned it over in her hands. Her name was written on the front in a font that felt almost mocking, too formal, too decorative for a woman who sat in the open-plan section between the printer and the fire exit. She set it aside and opened her computer and started her morning. Well, she didn't mention the invitation to anyone. That wasn't unusual. Vivian Hart did not have the kind of workplace friendships that involved confiding in people at the coffee machine. She was polite to everyone and close to no one, which was a distinction that most of her colleagues processed as coldness, when actually it was just self-preservation dressed neatly in professional distance. She heard Marcus at lunch, though. She was in the small kitchenette off the main corridor, eating a sandwich over the sink the way she did when she hadn't had time to go out, and the voices carried from the adjacent conference room where the door had been left partially open. Did she actually take it? She took it. That was Marcus. Amused. Set it right on her desk like she was expecting it. A woman's voice, Portia Ashby, senior associate, someone who wore her hair in a way that required 2 appointments a week. Oh, that's going to be awkward. She'll stand in a corner all night. You know what she's like. Maybe she won't come, said another voice. She'll come, Marcus said. That's the type. Quietly desperate to be included. She'll show up in something completely wrong, realize within 10 minutes that she doesn't belong, and spend the rest of the night pretending she's fine. Silence. Then laughter. The warm, collusive laughter of people who enjoy this kind of thing. Vivian finished her sandwich, rinsed the plate, dried her hands. She walked back to her desk. She sat down and she stared at the screen for a moment, and there was something shifting behind her expression. Not hurt, not anger. Something older than both of those things. A feeling you develop when you've been underestimated so many times that it stops surprising you, and becomes instead a kind of quiet, accumulated evidence that you file away because one day you think, one day all of this will matter. She opened her email. She typed a reply to the RSVP address. Please confirm my attendance. V. Hart. Then she picked up her phone and made a call she hadn't made in 2 years. Elise, she said when the line connected. I need a favor. I'm attending a black tie event on Friday, and I have nothing to wear. A pause. Then, from the other end of the line, finally, I've been waiting 6 years for you to call me for something like this. Elise Moreau was a fashion editor who had met Vivian in Brussels 11 years earlier, during a period in Vivian's life that no one at Sterling and Vale knew existed. They had stayed friends the way two specific kinds of women stay friends, not through constant contact, but through the particular mutual understanding of people who have seen each other under real pressure and come out respecting what they saw. Elise arrived on Thursday evening with a clothing bag and a bottle of wine and the unspoken energy of someone who had been sitting on an opinion for a very long time. She hung the bag on the back of Vivian's bedroom door and unzipped it and stepped back. Inside was a dress the color of dark crimson, deep and unapologetic, with a clean architectural structure at the shoulders and a fall of fabric that moved with controlled weight. It was not showy. It was the opposite of showy. It was the kind of dress that requires a woman to carry it rather than the other way around. I've had that for 2 years waiting for the right occasion, Elise said. I always thought you were the right woman for it. I just couldn't figure out when. Vivian looked at the dress. Something crossed her face. Not vanity, but recognition. The recognition of seeing something that matches a version of yourself you'd half forgotten. Put it on, Elise said. She did. And Elise, who had spent 20 years in fashion and had genuinely seen everything, sat down slowly on the edge of the bed and said nothing for a moment. You know what your problem is, she said finally. I imagine you're going to tell me. You've been hiding. Elise tilted her head. Not because you're afraid, because you got tired of what happened when you stopped hiding. But Vivian, you can't keep spending your life making yourself smaller so other people feel more comfortable. Vivian looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. Her reflection looked back. One evening, she said. I just need to get through one evening. Elise shook her head slowly. That's not what's going to happen. But all right, wear that. And wear your grandmother's earrings, the small gold ones. Nothing else. Friday came with the low gray light of an English autumn evening and the particular sharp cold that turns London streets honest and unforgiving. The Dorchester was lit the way old money always lights things. Not brightly, but thoroughly, every shadow purposeful, every surface reflecting just enough to remind you that you were in a place where the cost of a table setting exceeded a month of Vivian's salary. She arrived at 8:15, 2 minutes before the formal reception began. She had taken a taxi and she had sat in it the entire way, with her hands folded in her lap and her face completely calm, which is not the same thing as being calm, but it was close enough. The entrance hall was full of people she recognized from the office, sharper versions of their weekday selves, elevated by black tie and the social adrenaline of wanting to be seen. She saw the door first, 2 junior associates holding champagne flutes near the entrance. They turned when she came in. One of them actually stopped mid-sentence. She was aware of it, the way you're aware of weather changing. A slight pressure shift, something in the air adjusting. She didn't pause. She didn't check herself. She walked forward at the pace she always walked, which was not slow and was not hurried, and she handed her coat to the attendant and turned toward the ballroom. And the room, not all at once, but in the rippling way that a room full of people processes something unexpected, went quiet. Not completely. There was still music from the string quartet near the far wall, still the clink of crystal, still the murmur of 100 conversations. But in the immediate vicinity of the doorway, where she entered, there was the sudden involuntary pause of people confronted with something they hadn't prepared for. She was not what they expected. She was not the quiet, slightly out-of-place admin assistant they had imagined, standing uncertain in something unfortunate, grateful for the invitation and embarrassed by the room. She was composed. She moved through space with the unself-conscious ease of a woman who had stood in rooms like this before, who had spoken in rooms more formal and more hostile than this, and who understood that the only power a room has over you is the power you bring with you. The crimson dress caught the light exactly as Elise had known it would. Marcus Hale was standing 7 feet away with a glass of champagne, his head half turned toward a colleague mid-conversation when Vivian walked past him. He registered her a full 2 seconds after his colleague did. His expression went through 3 distinct stages: confusion, recognition, and something that took him a moment to identify because he'd never directed it at her before. He opened his mouth. She didn't look at him. Not dismissively, not pointedly. She simply didn't look at him because she was looking ahead toward the reception tables where a silver-haired man in a European-cut dinner jacket had just turned toward the entrance and stopped entirely still when he saw her. His name was Heinrich Braun. I was 64, a senior director of the Braun Educational Foundation, a man who had sat across from Vivian Hart in a meeting room in Zurich 8 years ago and watched her present a restructuring plan for a regional literacy initiative that had subsequently changed the educational outcomes of over 40,000 children across 3 countries. He crossed the room toward her at the kind of speed that turns heads. "Vivian," he said, and his voice had the controlled warmth of someone very accustomed to keeping public emotion in check. He took both her hands. "I had no idea you were connected to this firm." "It's been a quiet few years," she said simply. "Quiet." He repeated the word as though it were a small injustice. "After everything—" He caught himself, glanced around, smiled in the careful way that powerful men smile when they're reorienting. "We need to speak tonight. There is work I have been trying to restart for 18 months, and I've been looking for someone with your particular—" He searched for the word. "Integrity." "I'd like that," she said. He went to say something further and was interrupted by a woman beside him, another guest, someone Vivian didn't recognize, who had apparently overheard the name Vivian and leaned in with an expression of sudden alertness. "I'm sorry. Are you Vivian Hart?" "The Vivian Hart who ran the Northern European Education Partnerships." "I was part of that work, yes." The woman turned to the man beside her with an urgency that completely bypassed social convention. "This is her. I told you about her. The Geneva Report, the one the Hargreaves Institute published in 2019, she's cited in every foundational section." Vivian's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. Something very small and very old. The thing that lives in a person who spent years being dismissed and has never quite stopped being surprised when someone recognizes them anyway. Across the room, Nathan Sterling, 42, dark suit, champagne untouched on the table beside him, was watching all of this. He had arrived late, as he always did. He had been shaking hands and making the rounds, and performing the particular theater of a CEO at his own company's anniversary gala. And he had been doing it competently, and without particular feeling, when the shift in the room's attention had made him turn. He had seen the dress before he'd seen the face. Crimson, clean line. He'd thought colleague of someone, or journalist, or possibly the wife of one of the European investors. And then he'd looked at the face, and he'd stood there for a moment with a very specific and deeply uncomfortable feeling, the feeling of seeing something you've looked past 1,000 times, and suddenly, in a different light, not recognizing what you're looking at. He knew Vivian Hart. He knew her handwriting. He knew she made his coffee at the right temperature. He knew she caught errors in contracts that 3 qualified lawyers had missed. He knew she was quiet and competent and entirely easy to overlook. What he did not know, what was now, with the disorienting clarity of a room full of important people suddenly gravitating toward his executive assistant, beginning to become apparent, was who Vivian Hart actually was. He watched Heinrich Braun hold both her hands. He watched the cluster of people forming around her. He watched her face, composed, present, unhurried. And he thought, with a quiet and entirely uncomfortable honesty, "I have worked beside this woman for 6 years. I have no idea who she is." Marcus found him 20 minutes later. "Bit of a situation," Marcus said, in the low voice he used when situations embarrassed him. Nathan turned. "What situation?" "Vivian." Marcus tilted his head toward the far side of the room, where she was now in animated conversation with at least 6 people, 2 of whom Nathan recognized as representatives of the Lindqvist Group, Nordic investors the firm had been pursuing for 8 months. Apparently she has some kind of history in European philanthropy. Educational programs, some kind of human development work. I don't know the specifics. Nathan said nothing. "The Lindqvist people are very interested in her," Marcus said. "Which is, I mean, obviously that's useful for the firm if we can—" Why did she get an invitation? Marcus's expression shifted slightly, not guilt, more like a man recalibrating. The whole office was invited. That's not what I asked. A pause. It was meant as a... Marcus stopped, looked for the right word, didn't find one. Nathan looked at him. We thought she'd be out of her depth, Marcus said, finally, with the flatness of a man confessing something he's decided to reframe as honesty. It was supposed to be a bit of a laugh. The quiet one in admin, out of her element. Nathan said nothing for 5 full seconds. Then he looked back across the room at Vivian Hart, poised, brilliant, surrounded, utterly unhurried, and he felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite shame, but existed in the space between them where a person discovers they've been a certain kind of fool for a very long time. You invited her, he said slowly, as a joke. Marcus started to answer. Nathan picked up his champagne glass and walked away. Oh, later. Much later. When the speeches were done and the investors had been seated and the evening had taken on the quieter register of people who had eaten well and drunk carefully and were now talking in earnest, Vivian stood near the tall windows that overlooked Park Lane and held a glass of water and felt, for the first time in 6 years, the particular relief of a person who has spent too long being invisible. It wasn't triumph. She wasn't built for triumph. It was something quieter, the feeling of a room finally seeing what it had been looking at all along. She was tired, her feet hurt. The gold earrings felt heavier than she remembered, but she was still standing. That was the thing about Vivian Hart. She had always been still standing. Every dismissal, every invisible morning, every sticky note left on a contract she would never be credited for finding. Every coffee made it the right temperature for a man who had never once asked her name in a sentence that wasn't about the job. She was still standing, and now apparently so was everyone else, standing around her, wanting to talk, wanting to listen, wanting to hand her business cards with 2 hands the way Europeans do, a gesture of genuine respect. Across the room, she was aware of Nathan Sterling's eyes on her. She didn't turn toward him. Not yet. There would be time. The evening was not over. The morning after the gala, Sterling and Vale felt different, not physically. The same gray carpet, same humming printers, same fluorescent light that made everyone look slightly unwell. But something had shifted in the atmosphere the way a room shifts after an argument has happened in it. Everything in the same place, but rearranged in meaning. Vivian arrived at her usual time. Coat, bag, 2 coffees. She set one on Nathan's desk. She sat down at her own. She had slept 4 hours. Not from anxiety. From the particular wakefulness that comes when a long dormant part of your life suddenly reasserts itself in public, and you spend the rest of the night processing what that means. Her inbox had 17 new messages. 3 were from people she hadn't heard from in years. Former colleagues from the Brussels period, the Zurich period, the 18 months in Copenhagen that she had never once mentioned inside these walls. The others were from people she had met the night before, names she recognized attached to organizations she respected, all of them saying variations of the same thing. We didn't know you were here. We want to talk. She read them carefully and replied to none of them. Not yet. She had a contract review due by 9 and a set of board minutes to prepare, and 4 years of professional discipline that did not evaporate because one evening had gone unexpectedly. Marcus came in at 8:47. He didn't stop at her desk. He walked past it with his eyes aimed slightly above her head, in the precise way that men who have embarrassed themselves aim their eyes, not quite avoiding, just elevated enough to maintain the illusion of indifference. She watched him in her peripheral vision. He sat down at his own workspace across the open floor, opened his laptop, and became very interested in his screen. She went back to her contract review. At 9:15, her phone buzzed. Internal extension, Nathan's office. She picked up. Could you come in, he said. Not when you get a moment. Not if you're free. Just the direct form. She'd noticed over the years that his directness fluctuated depending on how he felt about something. Chattier when comfortable, shorter when something was sitting on him. 2 minutes, she said. She finished the paragraph she was reading, made a note in the margin, then walked to his office and knocked twice before opening the door. I was standing at the window. Not behind his desk, which was his usual position. Behind the desk was where Nathan Sterling operated by default, where the desk itself was part of the architecture of authority. Standing at the window was something else. Close the door, he said. She did. He turned around. In daylight, without the softening effect of gala lighting and champagne, He looked like a man who hadn't slept particularly well either. His suit was fine. His face was tired. I wanted to apologize, he said. She waited. For the invitation. He paused. I've been told that it wasn't extended to you in good faith. The precision of the language was interesting. I've been told. Not I know. Not I was part of it. But she had never expected him to be entirely honest in a first attempt, so she let it pass. It's fine, she said. It isn't, actually. He said it with a flatness that surprised her, like he'd rehearsed a softer version and abandoned it. Marcus thought it was funny. I didn't know about it until last night. But I'm responsible for the culture in this office, which means I'm responsible for the fact that something like that could happen and no one thought it was inappropriate. She studied him for a moment. He was looking at her with the particular expression of a man trying to determine whether he's being believed, which meant he was at least partially aware that he probably shouldn't be. All right, she said. That's all you're going to say? Would you prefer something longer? He opened his mouth, closed it, looked slightly wrong-footed, which was not an expression she had seen on him before. Heinrich Braun, he said, shifting. You know him well. We worked together for about 3 years, intermittently. He spoke very highly of you last night, very. He said the second very with something loaded in it. Not jealousy, not quite, but the discomfort of a man who has just discovered that someone he overlooked is regarded by people he respects as something significant. He mentioned the Northern European education partnerships. He mentioned Geneva. He stopped. Why didn't any of that come up in your interview? Vivian looked at him steadily. You didn't ask. A beat. 6 years, he said. I didn't ask. You asked if I could manage complex correspondence, if I was comfortable with confidential financial documentation, and whether I had experience supporting C-suite executives. She paused. I said yes to all 3. He looked at her for a long moment, not with the particular blankness of a man not listening, with the look of a man actually listening, which was, she thought, possibly a first. Why did you take this job? He said. If your background is... He gestured vaguely, which she understood to mean everything Heinrich Braun said last night. She considered the question. It deserved a real answer, not a deflective one. I needed something quiet, she said, for a while. And this was quiet. She didn't say, because I was tired. She didn't say, because the work I'd been doing for 8 years required a version of me that I needed to rest from. She didn't say any of the things that were actually true, because she was standing in her employer's office, and she had known this man for 6 years, and she still didn't fully trust him. He seemed to understand that the answer she'd given was partial. He didn't push it. The Lindqvist meeting is on Wednesday, he said. Annika Lindqvist specifically asked whether you would be present. Vivian blinked once. She asked about me specifically? She said, and I'm quoting, the woman in the red dress who was talking with Heinrich, I need her in the room. He said it without editorializing, just the facts. I don't know what you talked about last night, but apparently it made an impression. We talked about education funding models in post-industrial communities. She has a program she's been trying to scale for 2 years. She's been hitting structural problems. He stared at her. Structural problems I've seen before, she added. In a different context. There are solutions that aren't obvious from the inside. Right, he said slowly. So you'll be there. Wednesday. He paused. I'm not sure what your title would be for that meeting. Executive assistant, she said. That's my title. That's not... He stopped himself. Something moved across his face. Vivian, given what I now know about your background, I think there's a significant mismatch between... I'll be in the meeting, she said. We can talk about titles another time. It was not the answer he expected. She could see that. He had probably expected either gratitude, the quiet relief of a woman finally being seen, or resentment, and she was giving him neither. She was giving him something that took longer for people like him to process. Indifference to his assessment of her worth. Not hostile indifference, just the calm variety, the kind that comes from knowing your value and having stopped needing someone else to name it. She left the office. Outside at her desk, she sat down and looked at her screen and breathed once, slowly, through her nose. Her hands were steady. She was mildly furious. Those two things were not contradictory. The story broke on Tuesday afternoon. She hadn't anticipated it, which was her own fault. She should have known that a room full of people in a connected industry, witnessing something unexpected, would not contain it. Someone at the gala had posted. Then someone else had responded. By the time Vivian became aware of it, 3 different LinkedIn accounts had shared a photo taken from across the Dorchester ballroom. Her in profile, in the crimson dress, gesturing with one hand while Heinrich Braun and the Lindqvist representatives listened, captioned with variations of "Imagine inviting your admin assistant as a joke and finding out she's basically a legend in European humanitarian education." The post had, as of Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon, 47,000 interactions. She found out because Elise texted her, "You're going viral. Have you seen it? Don't read the comments." Actually read the comments, they're mostly wonderful. Portia Ashby came by her desk at 3. The expression on Portia's face was the expression of a woman who has spent considerable energy maintaining a specific social hierarchy and has just watched it develop a structural crack. "Quite a night Friday," Portia said. She was aiming for breezy. She landed somewhere closer to strained. "It was a nice event," Vivian said. "People are talking about you." "So I've heard." Portia leaned slightly against the partition. She was looking at Vivian with the recalibrating attention of someone trying to figure out how much they'd underestimated and whether it was recoverable. "The Geneva report. I looked it up this morning. You're cited quite extensively. I contributed some foundational research, yes." "You never mentioned it." Vivian looked at her. "You never asked." Portia had nothing for that either. She straightened up and left. 2 minutes later, Marcus appeared at her desk. He was not breezy. He was not even attempting breezy. "This social media thing," he said. "It's getting attention." "I know." The firm's being mentioned. In the context of, some of the posts are framing it as a class thing, like the company looked down on you. He was speaking rapidly, in the pressurized way of a man watching a situation expand past his control. "I need you to understand that it wasn't meant to—" "Marcus," she said. He stopped. "I'm going back to my contract review now," she said. "We can talk about this later if you'd like." He stood there for a moment. Then he walked away, and she could see the set of his shoulders, the rigid, humiliated set of a man who has never once in his adult life had a woman beneath his pay grade decline to engage with his anxiety. She went back to her contract review. The Wednesday meeting with the Lindqvist group was in the large glass-walled conference room on 43. Annika Lindqvist was 51, Norwegian, with close-cropped gray hair, and the particular authority of a woman who had built something from nothing and had stopped performing softness about it decades ago. She arrived with 2 colleagues and a folder and shook Nathan's hand with the efficient warmth of someone completing a formality. Then she saw Vivian. "Good," she said. "Just the one word." As though something had been confirmed. They sat. Nathan opened with the standard framing, the partnership proposal, the investment structure, the projected return timelines. His delivery was polished, as it always was. He was genuinely good at this part of the job. Vivian had always given him credit for that. Annika listened. Her colleagues took notes. And then, about 12 minutes in, Annika looked across the table at Vivian. "You understand the Stavanger model," she said. It wasn't a question. "I've studied it," Vivian said. "The core structure works. Your problem is the community integration layer. You've got funding and you've got physical infrastructure, but the local authority relationships aren't deep enough to make adoption sustainable. You get 1 or 2 years of good outcomes and then the whole thing softens when the novelty wears off." Annika's expression didn't change, but her posture did. A barely visible forward lean. "That's exactly it. How do you solve it?" "You embed the program in existing community structures before you build the new ones. There are organizations already operating in those areas, small, under-resourced, but trusted. You don't replace them. You resource them and align them. The community's loyalty to those existing relationships becomes the program's foundation." A pause. "We tried that in Bergen," Annika said. "It was complicated. Bergen had a governance problem. The existing organizations weren't given actual authority. They were given proximity to the funding without decision-making power. The community could see the difference." Annika looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Nathan. "She should be your lead consultant on this," she said, "not because of Friday. I didn't know who she was Friday. I just recognized she was someone worth knowing, because of this." She tapped the table once. "This is what I've been missing for 18 months. Nathan said, "I agree completely." He said it without hesitation, which Vivian noticed. Whatever he was not slow when opportunity became obvious. My title is executive assistant, Vivian said. Annika tilted her head slightly. Is that what you want to be called? It's what I am currently. Well, Annika closed her folder. That seems like something that could change. After the Lindqvist team left, warm, decisive, 3 times more engaged than they'd been at the start. Nathan stood at the window of the conference room for a moment. His reflection was faint against the grey London skyline. Vivian was gathering her notes. I'm going to create a position, he said. Strategic Partnerships Director. It would cover the Lindqvist relationship, and 3 other accounts where your background would be directly relevant. He paused. I'd like you to consider it. She looked at him. He was not looking at her in the way men sometimes do when they offer women things, with the self-congratulatory warmth of someone bestowing a gift. He was looking at her the way he looked at contract structures he was trying to get right, analytically, with something close to concern. I'll think about it, she said. Vivian, I'll think about it, she said again, not unkindly. She picked up her folder and left. That evening, Elise called. 47,000 has become 230, Elise said, without preamble. Vivian was on her sofa with her shoes off and a cup of tea that had gone cold while she stared at the middle distance. I know. There are journalists reaching out to you. 2 I recognize, one from The Guardian, one from a Culture and Society magazine. They want the human interest angle, the overlooked executive assistant with the extraordinary past. I don't want that. I know you don't. But Vivian, this is happening whether you engage with it or not. The question is whether you shape it or whether someone else does. She thought about Marcus, about the rigid set of his shoulders, about Portia's recalibrating eyes, about Nathan at the window, saying I didn't ask with the flat precision of a man confronting himself. The company's getting mentioned, she said. Yes, and not well. There's a thread, a fairly long one, about elite corporate culture and how firms like Sterling and Vail treat support staff. Someone with an HR background wrote a fairly detailed thread about structural dismissal of non-executive employees. It's got traction. Vivian closed her eyes. This was the part she hadn't wanted. She had wanted one evening. She had wanted to survive one evening with her dignity intact. She had not wanted a symbol to be built out of her. I didn't ask for this, she said. I know, love. Elise's voice was gentle, but not soft. But sometimes things happen to us that we didn't ask for. And the question isn't whether we wanted them. It's what we do when we're standing in the middle of them. Vivian said nothing. Nathan Sterling called me, Elise said. Vivian opened her eyes. He called you? He found my contact through some mutual connection in the industry. He wanted to ask whether you were all right. A pause. I thought that was worth telling you. Vivian looked at the ceiling. He could be doing it for the company's reputation, she said. He could be, Elise agreed. He also could just be a man who looked up from his own life for the first time in a while and felt bad about what he saw. Those aren't mutually exclusive. No, Elise said. They're usually not. Thursday arrived, and with it a meeting Vivian had not been invited to. She knew about it anyway. The firm's weekly partners meeting had been moved from its usual Friday slot to Thursday morning, which was irregular. The glass-walled room was booked under a code she recognized as internal crisis protocol, the same booking flag that had appeared during the Hargreaves compliance scare in 2022, the same one during the data breach the year after. She was not supposed to know this. She knew it because she had spent 6 years building an invisible cartography of how this building operated, every pattern and deviation, the way you learn a house, not by being shown around it, but by living in it long enough to know which floorboards creak. She went about her morning. At 11:15, Nathan came out of the meeting with the face of a man who has just had an unpleasant time. Marcus was behind him. 2 other partners, Gerald Fitch and Rosalind Crane, both senior, both powerful, both the kind of people who use the phrase optics with the frequency of someone who has never once stopped to consider the thing beneath the optics, followed, speaking in low, rapid voices. She caught fragments as they passed her station. Reputation damage is significant. We need her to make a statement. She's the story right now if she speaks positively about the firm. Nathan, if you're not going to manage this, someone needs to. Nathan stopped at her desk. Gerald and Rosalind stopped behind him, visibly impatient. Nathan looked at Vivian for a moment. Then he said very quietly, Are you free at 1? Yes. Lunch, he said. Not here. There's a place on Bruton Street. Gerald Fitch made a short, tight sound that was not quite a sigh. Nathan, we discussed this. We need a coordinated. I'll handle it, Nathan said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. There was something in his delivery that Vivian had not heard before. Not authority, exactly, which he wielded constantly, but something harder beneath it. A man who has made up his mind about something and is no longer interested in debate. Gerald looked at him. Then he looked at Vivian, and his expression was the expression of a man looking at a problem rather than a person. She looked back at him until he looked away. Nathan straightened up and walked toward his office. The partners dispersed separately, in the way that people disperse when a meeting hasn't gone the way they intended. Vivian went back to her work. At 12:55, she put on her coat and took the lift down to the ground floor. Outside, the autumn air hit her clean and cold off the street. She stood on the pavement for a moment before hailing a cab. Above her, through the glass facade of the building, she could see the 43rd floor. The same floor she had walked onto for 6 years, morning after morning, coat and coffee and silence. The floor where she had been invisible, efficiently and completely, for longer than she sometimes liked to think about. She was not invisible anymore. She wasn't sure yet how she felt about that. The cab pulled up. She got in. And through the window as the cab moved into traffic, she watched the building recede, all glass and clean lines and contained power, and thought about the thing Elise had said. Sometimes things happen to us that we didn't ask for. The question is what we do when we're standing in the middle of them. She didn't have the answer yet, but she was beginning to understand the question. That, she thought, was somewhere to start. The restaurant on Bruton Street was the kind of place that didn't have its name on the outside. Just a black door and a small brass number. The sort of establishment that operated entirely on the assumption that if you needed to find it, someone who already knew about it would have told you. Nathan was already there when Vivian arrived. He was at a corner table, not the center of the room, which surprised her. Nathan Sterling, in her experience, defaulted to center-of-room seating the way most people defaulted to breathing. The corner table felt like a choice, like he'd thought about it. He stood when she came in, which also surprised her. She sat down across from him and put her bag on the chair beside her and looked at the menu briefly, more for something to do with her hands than from any real interest in the food. I ordered water, he said. I didn't know I wasn't sure if you drink at lunch. Water is fine. A pause that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't hostile either. The particular silence of two people who have shared a professional space for years and have just discovered they don't actually know how to sit across from each other as equals. The partners want me to ask you to make a public statement, he said. He said it with the directness of a man getting something unpleasant out of the way first. Something supportive about the firm. They believe it would counter the negative coverage. Vivian looked at him. Is that why you invited me to lunch? No, I'm telling you because you should know they want it. I'm not asking you to do it. Why not? He looked slightly thrown by the question. Because it's not a reasonable thing to ask of you, given everything. Nathan, you've been asking unreasonable things of me for 6 years. You just didn't know that's what they were. He absorbed that without defending himself, which she noted. The partners think, he said carefully, that if I handle this correctly, the story dies in a week. Normal news cycle. Something else takes over. The firm weathers it. They're probably right, she said. I know they're right. He turned his water glass once. That's not the problem. She waited. The problem, he said, is that I keep thinking about what Gerald said in the meeting this morning. He called this a reputation management situation. And I looked around that table and every person there was nodding, and I thought, he stopped, seemed to be choosing the next part carefully. I thought, we're talking about you. We're sitting in a room talking about you like you're a variable in an equation, not a person who worked in our building for 6 years He shook his head. While I didn't ask a single question. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a black cab moved through the street in the particular unhurried way of London traffic that has given up on speed. What do you want from this lunch? She said. Nothing, he said. I thought you deserved a conversation that wasn't about the firm's interests for once. She studied him. He was not comfortable. She appreciated that. Comfortable would have felt like performance. The discomfort was evidence of something real occurring. A man actually sitting inside an unpleasant truth rather than managing his way around it. Tell me about Brussels, he said. She looked at him. You don't have to, he said quickly. I'm not asking for professional reasons. I'm asking because, he paused, I want to understand who you actually are. Not because it's useful, just because it's, I should have asked a long time ago. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she picked up her water and took a slow drink and made a decision that wasn't entirely comfortable for her either. I was 27 when I first went to Brussels, she said. I'd been working for a small NGO based in Edinburgh, education access programs, mostly in rural communities. Nothing high profile. She paused. A woman named Dr. Irene Claassen ran a pan-European literacy initiative out of a converted office building near the European Quarter. She'd been trying for 3 years to get institutional funding and kept being told the model wasn't scalable. She needed someone to restructure the funding application, rebuild the program architecture, make it legible to the kind of bodies that give large grants. And they sent you. Nobody sent me. I read about it in a newsletter, contacted her directly, flew to Brussels on my own money, and spent a weekend with her going through her documentation. She said it without drama, just the facts, in the sequence they happened. She offered me a position. I took it, for a salary that was not a lot of money. How long were you there? 4 years with the Brussels program, then 18 months restructuring a partner initiative in Zurich, then a year and a half in Copenhagen on something related but separate. She paused. 8 years in total. Different organizations, different structures, but connected work. And then you came back to London and applied to be an executive assistant. I came back to London, she said, and I needed to stop. He waited. She owed him no more than that, and they both knew it, and she appreciated that he didn't push. The work was, it matters enormously, she said. I believe that. I believed it every day. But it also requires something of you that doesn't have a clean edge. You're always in someone's crisis. You're always in the place where the problem is most acute. For 8 years, I slept in temporary accommodations and ate at my desk and put every good thing I had into someone else's emergency. She looked at him levelly. And then I was 35 years old, and I woke up one morning in Copenhagen, and I didn't know what I actually wanted anymore, because I'd spent so long giving everything to what was needed that I'd lost track of what I needed. Nathan was quiet for a moment. So you came home. I came home and I wanted something ordinary, something where I could do competent work and go home at a reasonable hour and have a life that belonged to me for a while. A small pause. I didn't expect to be here 6 years later. Why did you stay? She considered the question honestly. Inertia, she said. And it was fine. It was small and fine, and sometimes that's enough for a while. And then, she stopped. And then someone handed you an invitation as a joke, he said quietly. And then someone handed me an invitation as a joke, she confirmed. The food arrived. Neither of them had ordered anything elaborate, soup for her, a sandwich for him. And the arrival of it created a brief, necessary pause in the conversation, a chance to breathe. I'm sorry, he said. He said it into the table, not at her, which made it feel less rehearsed. Not the formal kind, not the company liability kind. Just, I'm sorry I didn't know you. I had 6 years to ask, and I didn't, and there's no reasonable explanation for that, except that I was looking in the wrong direction. She looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. It was not forgiveness, and it was not absolution, and she wasn't going to pretend it was either of those things. But it was acknowledgement, and sometimes acknowledgement is the most honest available response. They ate. They talked, haltingly at first, and then with more ease, about the Lindqvist program structure, about which aspects of it Vivian thought were genuinely promising and which were underfunded in ways that would surface as problems in the second year. He listened. He asked specific questions, the kind that indicated he was actually tracking what she was saying rather than waiting for his turn to speak. She found, to her mild surprise, that he had a sharper understanding of program design than she'd credited him with. He'd spent time in his early career on cross-sector partnerships before the money got big and the work got narrower. You know more about this than your job title suggests, she said at one point. That happens, apparently, he said. He meant it to include himself in the observation. She let it. They were 40 minutes in, the soup half gone, and the conversation finding its own cadence when his phone lit up on the table. He glanced at it. Something changed in his expression. Not much, just a compression around the jaw. "You can take it," she said. "It's Celeste." He said the name in a tone that was neither warm nor cold. Factual. He turned the phone face down. "It can wait." "Your fiancée shouldn't wait." "She's calling about Friday," he said flatly. "She has thoughts." "About the gala?" "About you." He said it without softening it. "She saw the social media coverage. It's been a topic of discussion this week." Vivian kept her expression neutral. She knew the name. Celeste Whitmore. Old money. Kensington. A woman whose photograph she had seen twice in society pages that had come across her desk in press review packets. She had formed no particular opinion. She was forming one now, based entirely on the compressed line of Nathan's jaw. "She thinks the whole thing has been handled badly," he said, "which isn't wrong. She also thinks I'm being manipulated." He paused. "Which is what she calls it when I change my mind about something she doesn't want me to change my mind about." Vivian said nothing. "She wants me to have Marcus issue a statement saying the invitation was a genuine gesture of inclusion and the social media narrative is a mischaracterization." He looked across the table with an expression that said he was aware of how that sounded. "I told her no." "How did that go?" "About how you'd expect." She picked up her spoon, set it down again. "Nathan, I don't want to be the reason your personal life becomes complicated." "You're not," he said. "You're the reason I noticed it was already complicated." He said it simply, not with the manufactured candor of a man trying to seem perceptive. Just a statement of fact. "That's different." His phone lit up again. He looked at it again, set it face down again. And the effort of doing that, the small, deliberate choice involved in it, was something Vivian watched and filed away without comment. By the time they left the restaurant, it was 2:15. The autumn light had softened to the particular gray gold that London does in October, a light that makes everything look simultaneously tired and beautiful. They stood on the pavement for a moment with the slight awkwardness of two people at the end of a conversation that covered more ground than expected. "The Strategic Partnerships Director position," he said. "I want you to think about it seriously." "I will." "It's a real offer, not a political gesture, not a response to the coverage." He looked at her directly. "I want you in a role that actually uses what you know. That should have happened years ago. It didn't, and I can't change that, but I can do something about it now." "I said I'll think about it," she said. Not warmly, not coldly, just plainly. He nodded once. He seemed to understand the register. Not a rejection, not an acceptance, but a woman reserving her right to make her own decision in her own time, which was not a dynamic he had perhaps experienced frequently in his working life. They went in different directions. Walking back toward the office, Vivian let herself process what the last hour had been. She was not naive. She knew that Nathan Sterling was a man in the middle of a situation that threatened the thing he'd built, and that his impulse to do better was partly genuine and partly the instinctive scrambling of someone who had looked in a mirror and didn't like the angle. She was not going to mistake the scrambling for transformation. Transformation took longer than one bad week and one honest lunch. But there had been moments at that table that felt real. The discomfort, the questions, the way he'd said I should have asked a long time ago without making it about himself after saying it. Those weren't nothing. She crossed into Grosvenor Square and the traffic noise shifted, slightly muffled by the trees, and she let herself have one private moment of something that wasn't quite hope, but was adjacent to it. The feeling of possibility reconsidering itself, turning over slowly like weather about to change. Then she straightened her coat and walked back to the office. She had minutes from a board meeting to transcribe and a contract addendum due before 5 and an inbox full of messages from people she hadn't replied to yet. The work was still the work. That hadn't changed. Nothing had fully changed yet. But things that shift start by shifting small, and she had been paying attention to small things her whole professional life. She knew how to watch for what mattered, and something, she was almost certain, was beginning to matter. The dinner with the foreign investors was scheduled for the second Thursday of November, 3 weeks after the gala, and it had been on the firm's calendar since August. A private dining event at a members club in St. James's, the kind of place with oil portraits in the hallways and waiting staff who moved like they'd been trained specifically to be invisible. The guest list was carefully constructed. 6 representatives from the Lindqvist Group, 2 from a Frankfurt-based investment consortium called Albrecht Partners, Nathan and 2 of his senior partners, and, at Annika Lindqvist's direct request, which Nathan had communicated to Vivian in writing, Vivian herself. Her attendance had not gone uncontested. Gerald Fitch had objected twice in the week leading up to the dinner, once in a partners' meeting that Vivian wasn't present for but heard about through the particular ambient intelligence she'd developed over 6 years of sitting at the center of a busy floor, and once, more directly, in a conversation with Nathan that happened 4 feet from her desk with the door to the small conference room left open an inch. Enough. It sends a confused message, Gerald had said. She's not a partner, she's not a director yet. Having her at a formal investor dinner as though it's unclear what she represents. She represents the firm, Nathan had said. She represents an ongoing PR situation that we haven't fully resolved. Every person at that table has seen the coverage. If she walks in, it becomes the story again. Annika Lindqvist asked for her specifically. Then manage Lindqvist's expectations. A pause. She's coming, Nathan said. That's not a discussion. Vivian had gone back to her typing. Her face had given nothing away. But she sat with that exchange for the rest of the afternoon, turning it over. Not with pleasure, not with resentment, just with the quiet alertness of someone who understands that the battle over their presence in a room is sometimes more revealing than anything that happens once they're in it. She arrived at the dinner in a midnight blue dress that Elise had helped her find, simpler than the crimson, built for a working evening rather than an entrance. She was not trying to replicate the gala. The gala had been, in its way, an accident, a version of herself that had surfaced unexpectedly and surprised everyone, including her. This was different. This was deliberate, and deliberate required a different register. The private dining room was warm-lit, dark wood, the kind of table that had probably absorbed 40 years of deals and decisions. She came in with Nathan, walked to her assigned seat, and managed the greetings with the ease of a woman who had done versions of this before, in rooms more formal, in languages not her first, with significantly less institutional support behind her. Annika Lindqvist arrived 7 minutes later with her 2 colleagues and moved immediately to Vivian with the directness of a woman who doesn't waste entry time on the wrong people. I've been looking forward to this, Annika said, settling into the adjacent chair. I reread the Copenhagen report, the one from 2018. You're not credited on it, but I know your analysis is in the 3rd section, the comparative framework. You read carefully, Vivian said. I always do. Annika glanced across the table where the Albrecht Partners representatives were making introductions with Nathan and Gerald. The Frankfurt group is cautious. They want numbers more than philosophy. You'll need to speak their language in the second half of the evening. I can do that. I know you can. That's why I asked for you. The dinner began. For the first hour it went well. The food was good, the conversation moved fluidly between social and substantive, and Vivian found her footing in the flow of the room without difficulty, asking questions when it served the conversation, offering analysis when it was useful, staying quiet when quiet was the right instrument. The Albrecht representatives warmed to her more quickly than she'd expected. One of them, a compact, methodical man named Dieter Albrecht, the younger of 2 brothers who ran the firm, had apparently done his own research and spent 15 minutes asking her detailed questions about funding sustainability models that had nothing to do with Sterling and Vail and everything to do with what she knew. Nathan watched this from 2 seats down. She was aware of it, but was not watching with possessiveness or anxiety. He was watching the way someone watches a thing they underestimated prove itself, with the specific discomfort of a man measuring the gap between what he assumed and what was actually true. The trouble started at 8:45. Celeste Whitmore arrived at 8:40. She was not on the guest list. Vivian clocked this immediately because she had prepared the guest list and she had a functional memory. Celeste arrived at the door of the private dining room in a cream-colored dress that required its own kind of confidence, said something brief to the member of staff at the entrance, and was shown in. Nathan saw her and went very still. He rose from his seat, excused himself quietly, met Celeste near the door, and they exchanged something in low voices. Not an argument, not yet, but with the clipped efficiency of people who have been arguing for days and are temporarily suspending it for a public setting. Vivian watched this without watching it, which was a skill she had perfected. She kept her conversation with Dieter Albrecht continuous and attentive while processing the situation in a separate register. Celeste Whitmore was 36, dark-haired, and possessed of the kind of physical presence that came not from beauty alone, but from a lifetime of being treated as though her presence was the most important thing in any given room. She had grown up in a world where that was simply true, and it had calcified into a bearing that was almost architectural. Not arrogance, precisely, but something close to it dressed in better clothes. She sat down at the table. Someone found her a chair. Nathan returned to his seat with the expression of a man who has just agreed to something he already regrets. For the next 20 minutes, Celeste was gracious in the surface manner of someone performing graciousness. She spoke to the Lindqvist representatives with the warm, slightly over-attentive manner of someone compensating for something. She was charming to Dieter Albrecht. She was Vivian observed with the detached precision of someone who had worked in rooms full of complicated social dynamics, working very hard. Then Annika said something that shifted the air. It happened naturally, as these things do. Annika was making a point about the community integration model, referencing something Vivian had said earlier in the week, and she turned to Vivian and said, "You explained it better than I can. Would you walk us through the framework again?" And Vivian did. She spoke for perhaps 3 minutes, specific and clear, building the argument in layers the way she had learned to do for rooms that contained multiple kinds of expertise. When she finished, there was a moment of genuine, appreciative silence from the Lindqvist and Albrecht sides of the table. Celeste set down her wine glass. "It must be so satisfying," she said. The tone was warm on the surface. Underneath it was something else entirely. Vivian heard it. Annika heard it. Several other people at the table heard it without quite knowing yet what they were hearing. "I'm sorry," Vivian said. "To finally be getting the recognition." Celeste smiled. The smile had the quality of something carefully assembled. "After years of, what is it you do here, officially? Admin support? It must feel very validating, for someone in your position." The table went quiet. Not immediately. There were 1 or 2 seconds where the conversation in adjacent pockets of the table continued, and then those conversations felt the silence spreading from the center and stopped. Nathan said, "Celeste, I'm just saying," Celeste continued, with the particular momentum of someone who has wanted to say something for weeks and has miscalculated the moment, "that it's a lovely story, the overlooked assistant who turns out to have a past. Very cinematic." She reached for her wine. "I'm sure the social media attention has been wonderful." Dieter Albrecht put down his fork. Vivian looked at Celeste Whitmore for a long, steady moment. She felt the eyes of the table on her, waiting for the reaction, for the wince, for the wounded silence. She felt Nathan 2 seats away like a static charge. She let 3 seconds pass. Then she said, calmly and without heat, "I'm not sure what reaction you're hoping for, but I don't have one to offer." Celeste's smile held, but something behind it flickered. "I wasn't the framework I was describing," Vivian said, and turned back to Annika and Dieter with the deliberate ease of a woman who has decided a thing doesn't merit more than 10 seconds of her attention. Hinges on the distinction between resource provision and authority transfer. The Bergen model failed because, "Excuse me," Celeste said. Her voice had lost its warmth entirely. "I'm speaking." "You finished," Vivian said. Not unkindly. Not with performance. Just a statement of fact in the same tone she might use to note that a document had been filed. The silence this time was different, sharper. Annika Lindqvist was looking at Celeste with the particular expression of a Scandinavian woman who has decided someone is wasting her time and has stopped trying to hide it. Dieter Albrecht had sat back in his chair by a fraction of an inch, barely perceptible. But in body language terms, it was the equivalent of a step backward. Nathan stood up. "Celeste," he said. His voice was quiet and final. "Can I speak with you outside?" "Nathan, I'm simply—" "Outside," he said. "Please." She looked at him. Something moved across her face. Surprise. And then something harder beneath the surprise. The look of a person who has just registered that the person they expected to manage this situation is not managing it the way they expected. She rose from the table. The movement was controlled. Nathan held the door for her and they went out. The room sat with the aftermath for a moment. Then Annika said, to no one in particular, "Well," a single syllable carrying remarkable weight. Dieter Albrecht looked at Vivian. "The authority transfer point," he said. "I want to understand the distinction more specifically, in the context of local governance structures." Vivian looked at him. Something in her chest unclenched by a small, precise amount. "Let me give you a concrete example," she said. The conversation resumed. Outside the dining room, through the closed door, there were voices. She could not hear the words. The door was too solid, the dining room too well insulated. but the cadence was audible. First Celeste's voice, high and sharp. Then Nathan's, lower, slower. Then Celeste's again, and this time there was something in it that was less argument and more the sound of a situation fracturing along a line that had been forming for a long time. Nobody at the table commented on this. Social intelligence, in rooms like this one, includes knowing when to build a bridge of continuing conversation over a difficult silence. Vivian kept talking to Dieter Albrecht. The Lindqvist colleagues rejoined the thread. Gerald Fitch, who had said almost nothing for the last 20 minutes, picked up his wine and drank with the expression of a man watching something he'd predicted and didn't enjoy being right about. Nathan came back in at 9:18, alone. He sat down. He had the look of a man who has been through something and has put it away, at least temporarily, in the particular internal compartment that professionals use to get through the rest of an evening. His face was composed. His eyes were tired. He caught Vivian's glance for half a second. She gave him nothing, not sympathy, not curiosity, just looked away and continued the point she was making. The dinner went on another 40 minutes. At the end of it, when coats were being retrieved and goodbyes exchanged in the hallway, Annika Lindqvist touched Vivian's arm briefly. "I want to say something," she said, quietly enough that it was only for Vivian. "All right. What happened at this table tonight? The way you handled it?" She paused. "I've been in many rooms where someone tries to diminish a person to control the narrative of the room. Usually it works to some degree. People flinch. They over-explain. They try to prove they deserve to be there." She looked at Vivian with the level regard of a woman who had been tested many times herself. "You just kept talking about the work. That's harder than it looks." Vivian said nothing for a moment. "It's the only thing that actually matters," she said finally. Annika nodded once, slowly. "The partnership," she said. "We'll move forward with it. I'll have my people contact you directly." She paused. "Not through Sterling and Vale's standard channels. You, specifically." She left. Vivian stood in the hallway with her coat over her arm for a moment, the other conversations flowing around her, and she thought about that. You, specifically, and the weight of it, which was not small. Gerald Fitch passed her on the way out. He didn't say anything, but he stopped for just a moment, and the look he gave her was not the look he'd given her before. It wasn't warmth, it wasn't apology. It was the recalibrating look of a man who has spent a career reading rooms and has just been forced to read one differently. He gave a short nod and moved on. Nathan found her last. The hallway was nearly empty. The waiting staff were clearing with the quiet efficiency of people well practiced at becoming invisible, and Vivian was putting on her coat when he came up beside her. "I need to apologize," he said, "for tonight." "Celeste apologizes for herself. That's not on you." "It is, actually." He said it with a flatness she was beginning to recognize as his particular mode of honesty, the kind he used when he'd stopped managing his way around a thing. "She came because I told her you'd be here. She's been building toward this for 2 weeks, and I let it build instead of dealing with it because I didn't want to deal with it." He looked at the middle distance. "That was a choice. What happened at that table was the consequence." Vivian buttoned her coat. "Are you all right?" she said. He looked slightly surprised by the question, as if he'd expected something else from her. Anger, perhaps, or the cool professional distance she usually maintained. "I don't know," he said. "Honest, at least." "The Albrecht group isn't walking away," she said. "Dieter wants a follow-up call next week." Annika confirmed the partnership. She paused. The evening was a success, in the ways that were in anyone's control. He looked at her. "You don't have to do that," he said. "Tell me the professional outcomes. I'm not asking for reassurance." "I know you're not," she said. "I'm telling you because they're true, and true things are worth saying even when everything else is a mess." He was quiet for a moment. "I ended things with Celeste," he said, "in the hallway. I know that's—" He stopped. "It's not something you need to know. I don't know why I said it." She looked at him. "Yes, you do," she said simply. She said goodnight. She walked out into the November cold, down the steps and onto the pavement, where the city moved around her with its usual indifference to the specific weight of individual evenings. Her phone buzzed. "Elise. How was it?" She thought about how to answer that. She stood under a street lamp while a cab went past, and the cold found its way through her coat. "Complicated," she typed. "Real," both at once. She put the phone away and walked toward the main road. and she let the cold do its work on her, clearing the residue of the evening, the tension and the small triumph and the larger unresolved things that didn't have names yet. She was not naive enough to think the worst was behind her. Gerald Fitch would not become a different man because of one dinner. The firm's instinct to protect itself had not dissolved. And Nathan Sterling, whatever he was becoming, was still at the very beginning of becoming it. Still a man who had to learn what it cost to see people clearly, and whether he was willing to pay that cost when it became inconvenient. None of that was resolved. But Annika Lindqvist had said you specifically, and that belonged only to Vivian, not to the firm, not to the coverage, not to the story other people were building around her. To her own competence, her own history, the work she had done before anyone in that building knew her name. She had always been worth knowing. It was merely beginning, at last, to become impossible to ignore. The letter of resignation was not dramatic. Vivian wrote it on a Sunday evening in December, 6 weeks after the St. James's dinner, at the small desk in her flat with a cup of tea gone cold at her elbow, and the particular quiet of a city that has finally stopped pretending it isn't winter. She wrote 3 drafts. The first was too long. The second explained too much. The third was 8 sentences, professional, specific, grateful for nothing that wasn't true, and she read it twice, changed one word, and printed it. She had thought it would feel larger than it did. 6 years was not nothing. The gray carpet, the humming printers, the coffee at the right temperature, the sticky notes on contract pages that caught the errors 3 qualified lawyers had missed. 6 years of making herself small enough to fit inside someone else's idea of what she was. It felt mostly like exhaling. She put the letter in an envelope and set it on the corner of the desk and went to bed and slept 8 hours straight, which was something she hadn't managed consistently since before Copenhagen. She gave the letter to Nathan on Monday morning, in person, directly, before she sat down or took off her coat. He read it standing up, and when he looked up, his face had the expression of a man who had known something was coming and had hoped the knowing would make it easier when it arrived. It hadn't. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "I know." The strategic partnerships position. It's real, Vivian. It was never about the coverage. "I know that too." She paused. "That's not why I'm leaving." He looked at the letter again, not because there was anything new in it, but because it gave him somewhere to look. "Then tell me why." She thought about how to say the true thing without turning it into a speech. "Because I need to figure out what I actually want, not what's being offered, not what makes sense given the current situation." She looked at him steadily. "What I want? On my own terms, without this building and everything that happened in it shaping the answer." A beat. "I haven't asked myself that question honestly in a very long time, and I can't answer it from inside these walls." He was quiet. "Where will you go?" "I don't know yet. That's the point." He set the letter on his desk. He looked at her with something that was not the look of an employer losing a useful employee. It was more complicated than that and less comfortable than that. The look of a person losing someone they had only just started to understand, and carrying the weight of knowing the loss was a fair consequence of having taken so long to look. "I'm sorry it took an invitation used as a joke for me to see you," he said. It was the most honest thing he had said to her that didn't involve professional analysis. She felt it land, which surprised her slightly, because she had spent several weeks constructing a careful, necessary distance from this particular emotion. "People see what they're looking for," she said. "You weren't looking. That's not entirely your fault." A pause. "It's also not entirely not your fault. But I'm not leaving angry. I want you to know that." He nodded once. His jaw was tight in the way it got when he was holding something in that he hadn't figured out how to say yet. "The internal review," he said. "I filed it last week." She looked at him. "Formal review of conduct and compensation policies. Support staff inclusion in professional development. Career pathway structures." He said it without the air of a man announcing something impressive. More like a man reporting on a debt he was trying to pay, knowing it wouldn't cover the full amount. Gerald objected twice. Rosalind threatened to bring it to the full board. I filed it anyway. She absorbed that. "Why are you telling me?" she said. "I've already resigned. It doesn't change anything for me." "I know it doesn't." He held her gaze. "I'm telling you because you should know that something real came out of this. Something that isn't a news cycle. Because you deserve to know the building is at least slightly different because you were in it." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Gerald Fitch's objections, about Rosalind Crane's threat, about the years of friction. Nathan was now choosing to absorb because he had finally decided something mattered more than comfort. She thought about whether that made him a changed man or simply a man in the process of changing, which was a different thing entirely and a more honest one. Good, she said, just the one word. He seemed to understand that was what he was going to get, and that it was, given everything, enough. She left the office. The rest of the day had the particular texture of a last day everywhere. Familiar things carrying the slight unreality of things you know you're experiencing for the final time. The gray carpet. The printer. The window at the end of the floor that looked out over a slice of London skyline she had stared at on hundreds of slow afternoons. Portia Ashby came by her desk mid-morning and stood there with the expression of someone who had rehearsed something and was now uncertain about it. I read the Hargreaves paper, Portia said, the full version, not just the abstract. A pause. I owe you an apology. Not only for the invitation, for 6 years of not taking you seriously. Vivian looked at her. Portia's discomfort was real. It had the raw quality of genuine feeling rather than managed guilt. She gave her that. Thank you for saying it, Vivian said. Not warmly, but without coldness either. The temperature of something accepted for what it was. Marcus did not come by her desk. She had not expected him to, and she found she had no particular feeling about it. Not contempt, not lingering hurt, just the mild absence of interest that settles over you once a wound has finished mattering. He would have to find his own way to whatever reckoning was waiting for him. That was not her work. She cleared her workspace with the efficient brevity of someone who had never accumulated much. A few books, a good pen, a ceramic mug she'd brought from home 2 years ago. And in the back of the top drawer, the small framed photograph she kept there that no one in 6 years had ever asked about. Copenhagen. Midwinter. A group of people standing outside a community center that had just opened its doors for the first time, everyone slightly blurred from cold and movement and the particular giddiness of finishing something real. She was on the left edge, half out of frame, her coat too thin for the weather. She was 34. She was laughing at something someone had just said. She looked, she thought, looking at it now. She looked alive. Not happy in a simple way. Alive in the complicated way, which was better. She put the photograph carefully in her bag. Nathan walked her to the lift at 5 o'clock. He didn't make a production of it. He simply came out of his office and fell into step beside her, which was something he had never once done in 6 years. And they walked the length of the 43rd floor together in silence. That was, for the first time between them, not the silence of invisibility or distance, but the silence of two people who have said the things that mattered and are letting them settle. At the lift he pressed the button. There'll be a reference, he said, from me personally, not HR, whenever you need it. Thank you. And Vivian, he stopped, seemed to make a decision about something. For what it's worth, whatever you do next, it'll be the right thing, because you'll have chosen it. The lift arrived. She stepped in and turned around and looked at him through the open doors, standing in the hallway of the building where she had been invisible for 6 years, looking at her now with the full, uncomfortable attention of a man who had finally learned to see. Take care of yourself, Nathan, she said. You too, he said. The doors closed. She rode down 43 floors alone and walked out into the December dark, and that was that. 6 years, 8 sentences, 1 exhale. She took the tube home and sat in the suspended intimacy of a crowded carriage and let the city move around her underground and let herself feel, without managing it, the full strange weight of being entirely without a plan for the first time in longer than she could precisely measure. It was uncomfortable. It was also the first genuinely free feeling she could remember in years. Those two things coexisted without canceling each other out, which was, she was beginning to understand, how most real things worked. The planlessness lasted about 4 days. On the 5th day, she cleaned her flat with a thoroughness that surprised even her. On the 6th, she called her sister in Edinburgh, a call that lasted 2 hours and covered territory they hadn't talked about in nearly a decade. Things from before Brussels, things from growing up, things that had been sitting in the back of the conversation, waiting for someone to have enough time to open them. It was not a comfortable call. It was a necessary one. When she hung up, she felt wrung out in the clean way that necessary things leave you. On the 7th day, Heinrich Braun called. She was in her kitchen making actual breakfast for the first time in what felt like months, when her phone rang with an international number she recognized from the Zurich years. I've been waiting a week to call, Heinrich said, without preamble. Annika told me you'd left. I didn't want to call too quickly and seem opportunistic. A week is fairly quick, she said. I'm 70 years old. I don't have time for the longer version of restraint. There was warmth in his voice, and beneath it the particular urgency of a man who understood that good people and good timing rarely coincide without effort. There's a program relaunching in the spring, Northern European, connected to the original Brussels work, actually. Same foundational philosophy, new structure. We have funding this time, solid funding, properly secured, and I have a good team. What I don't have is the right person to design the community architecture and manage the first 18 months of implementation. She set down her fork. I've been thinking about you for this role since the night I saw you at the Dorchester, he said. I waited until you were free before calling because I wanted you to have the space to choose it rather than arrive at it because nothing else was available. She looked out her kitchen window at the December street below. A woman walking a dog. A child in a school coat too thin for the weather. The ordinary complicated texture of a city morning. What's the timeline? She said. I'd need you by March at the latest. Probably February if you want to be part of the planning phase, which I think you'd want to be. Where's it based? London and Amsterdam, split roughly 60-40. Some travel beyond that, but moderate. Managed. He paused. I know you burned out before, Vivian. I'm not asking you to do that again. I'm asking you to do the work you're actually built for at a pace that doesn't require you to disappear into it. She was quiet for a moment. Give me a week, she said. Take 2. She took 10 days. She thought about it honestly, the way she was trying to think about things now, without the reflexive yes that came from needing to be needed, and without the reflexive no that came from fear dressed up as caution. She made a list of what she needed from work, which was something she hadn't done since her mid-20s. The list was shorter than she expected and more specific than she expected, and the position Heinrich was describing matched it in every meaningful way. She called him back on a Thursday morning. Yes, she said. Good, he said. No elaborate relief, no performance of delight, just the quiet satisfaction of something falling into the right place. I'll send the contracts tomorrow. She started in February. By March, she was in Amsterdam 3 days a week, working out of a modest office on a canal street with 4 colleagues who were varying combinations of brilliant, difficult, overcommitted, and completely indispensable. One of them, a young program coordinator named Sophie, who was 26 and operated on approximately 3 hours of sleep and an unnerving amount of conviction, reminded Vivian of herself at that age, which was both encouraging and concerning. You're going to burn yourself out, Vivian told her, one evening when Sophie was still at her desk at 8:30 for the 3rd consecutive night. I know, Sophie said, without looking up from her screen. I'll stop when the report's done. You said that last Wednesday. The report is bigger than I thought. Vivian set a cup of tea on the edge of Sophie's desk and sat in the chair across from her. The work will still need doing when you've slept. The problems will still be there. The communities we're building this for will still need the program in 6 months, and they'll need it built by someone who hasn't hollowed themselves out. Sophie looked up. Did someone say that to you once? Not early enough, Vivian said. Sophie picked up the tea. How do you know when you're close to the edge? You stop being able to remember what you wanted before the work existed. Vivian paused. When you can't picture who you are outside of this room, that's when you're already past it. Sophie looked at her for a moment. She stopped. Okay, I'll finish this section and go home. Finish the section, Vivian agreed. She walked home that evening along the canal, the April cold still sharp off the water, the light lasting longer now than it had been. She thought about what she'd said to Sophie and how long it had taken her to learn it, and whether learning it earlier would have changed the 8 years she'd spent, or whether those years were the necessary material out of which the understanding was built. She didn't know. That was one of the questions she'd stopped expecting to resolve. She was not fixed. She knew that. She was not the luminous, healed version of herself that stories like to produce at the end of difficult chapters. She still had weeks where the weight of the invisible years at Sterling and Vale pressed on her at 2 a.m, in the particular way of things you thought you'd processed, and apparently hadn't entirely. She still had moments where she defaulted to smallness, offering less opinion than she had, taking up less space than she'd earned, and had to actively correct it, like a posture that needed constant adjustment because the muscles hadn't fully learned the new position yet. But she was sleeping. She had a favorite coffee place 2 streets from the Amsterdam office. She had started reading again. Not policy papers, not reports, but novels. The long kind. The kind where you lose track of time. She called her sister every 2 weeks. She had dinner with Elise whenever she was in London, and those dinners had become the kind that go past midnight, not because anything particular is being resolved, but because the conversation itself is the point. She was in the imprecise and ongoing way of someone actively building rather than arriving. Okay? More than okay. She was in the process of being herself, which was harder than it sounded and more valuable than she had let herself believe for a long time. In July, she got a text from Elise with a link and 2 words. Read this. Nathan had published something, not through the firm's communications team, not a managed statement, a personal essay in a mid-sized culture and business magazine that had enough credibility to matter and enough independence to publish something that a PR team would never have approved. The title was plain, What I Got Wrong. She read it sitting on a canal-side bench on her lunch break with her coat on because Amsterdam in July remained stubbornly unconvinced about warmth. The essay was not polished. That was the first thing she noticed. It had the uneven quality of writing done by someone who was thinking through the page, rather than presenting a conclusion they'd already reached. There were sentences that started one way and ended somewhere else. There were moments where he clearly wanted to explain himself and then stopped short of the explanation, which was more honest than the explanation would have been. He wrote about Sterling and Vale, not the official version, not the values statement, and the diversity initiatives and the community partnerships listed on the company website. The actual version. The floor culture. The way certain kinds of competence were treated as decoration rather than substance. The way support staff were simultaneously essential and expendable, and how that contradiction was never examined because examining it would have required someone to ask who it served. He wrote about what he had called, in his own firm, a reputation management situation, and about the moment he'd heard himself say it and understood what it meant to talk about a person that way. To reduce a human being with a history and a mind and 8 years of work that had changed tens of thousands of lives, to a variable in an equation about perception. He wrote about the Gala, about seeing Vivian walk into the Dorchester and not recognizing her. Not because she had changed, but because he had never looked. He did not name her. But the essay was not ambiguous about who it was about, and anyone who had followed the coverage from October would know. She found she didn't mind. He had written about her with the particular respect of a man who understood that she was the occasion for his reckoning, but not the subject of it. The subject was himself, and what he had failed to be, and what he was trying to become. That was the correct order of things. Near the end he wrote, I have spent most of my professional life measuring people by their utility to the organization I built. I had no real framework for valuing what a person simply was, their history, their interior life, the knowledge they carried that never appeared on a performance review. That's not a small failure. It accumulates. It calcifies into culture, and culture calcifies into a kind of institutional cruelty that nobody specifically intends but everybody enables, because enabling it is easier than the cost of refusing to. She read that paragraph twice. She sat with it. She thought about whether it was enough. Not whether it fixed what had happened. Nothing fixed what had happened. The invisible years were what they were, and no essay rewrote them. But whether it was real. Whether it was the work of a man genuinely trying to see more clearly, or the work of a man managing his reputation by performing self-awareness. She had spent enough time in enough rooms with enough complicated people to know that those two things were rarely completely separate. That people who were genuinely changing still had instincts towards self-protection, and people who were mostly performing still, sometimes accidentally told the truth. The binary was cleaner in stories than in life. She decided to take the essay at what it was. Incomplete, honest in its incompleteness, worth something without being everything. That was all she needed it to be. She texted Elise, I read it. He meant it, I think. Or he's trying to. Elise replied immediately. Same thing at the beginning, I think. Also, he's funding a legal aid program, Annika told me, started in March, working with a barrister on free services for low-income families in South London. Vivian stared at that for a long moment. She thought about the version of Nathan Sterling she had handed coffee to for 6 years, polished, contained, operating entirely within the comfortable radius of his own interests. She thought about the version she had seen at the Bruton Street restaurant, discomforted and trying anyway. She thought about this version Elise was describing now, doing something that returned nothing financially and required him to sit across from people whose lives bore no resemblance to his own, and understand slowly what that meant. People were not static. That was the thing she kept having to relearn. The people who hurt you, and the people who dismissed you, and the people who handed you invitations as jokes, they were not finished. Neither were you. That didn't obligate you to wait for them, or forgive them on their schedule, or make their transformation your responsibility. But it meant the story wasn't over just because the worst part of it was. She put her phone in her pocket and went back to work. She saw him in September, a book fair in the courtyard of a South Bank Arts Centre on a Saturday afternoon, the kind of event that draws a London cross-section. Readers, parents, older people with canvas bags, the occasional person who has retained, despite everything, the capacity to simply browse. She was there because she had a free Saturday for the first time in 3 weeks, and because she had been inside her own head too much lately, and books were, for her, one of the reliable remedies for that. I was at a table near the back, in the section that was half philosophy and half social theory, standing with a book open and reading with the concentrated stillness of someone who had genuinely forgotten where they were. He looked different, not in a dramatic way, not gaunt from suffering or bright from transformation, nothing so cinematic. He just looked like a person. The Sterling and Vale version of Nathan had always read, in some register she'd never quite named, like a man performing the role of himself. This version looked like the role had been set down somewhere, and he was figuring out what was underneath it. He looked up and saw her and went very still for 1 second. She walked over, not hurrying, not hesitating. "Vivian," he said. "Nathan." He looked briefly like a man trying to determine if he should apologize for occupying the same space. She let him get past it by asking what he was reading, which was a book on the philosophy of institutional responsibility. And she asked a real question about it, and he gave a real answer, and they were in a conversation before either of them had decided to be. They moved through the fair slowly. It was not comfortable in the uncomplicated way. There were moments where the weight of the history between them surfaced and had to be acknowledged, briefly, before they could continue. He asked about Amsterdam and listened with the full attention of someone who was actually interested rather than waiting for his turn. She asked about the legal aid program, and he talked about it without the self-promotional sheen that characterized the way he used to discuss the firm's work. He talked about the case backlog, about the barrister he worked with, a woman named Priya who had been doing this work for 15 years on almost no resources, and who intimidated him in ways he found genuinely useful. About a family he'd met 3 weeks ago, whose situation had made him sit in his car for 20 minutes afterward before he trusted himself to drive. "You're different," she said. They had stopped near a table of poetry collections, which neither of them was looking at. He turned it over. "I think I'm less padded than I was. Less buffered from things." He paused. The buffering felt like strength for a long time. Turns out it was just insulation. I could afford to be insulated from things that were actually important, so I was. Remove that, and you have to start actually deciding what you think. Has it been hard? He looked at her with the honesty of a man who has stopped managing his own image in conversation with her, which had happened gradually over the last several months and was, she thought, probably one of the more significant changes. "Yes," he said. "Not in ways I'm going to complain about, but yes." She nodded. "The review I filed," he said. "It went through, took 4 months and 2 outside consultants and a board meeting that I would not describe as pleasant. But the policies changed. Compensation benchmarking for support staff, formal career pathway structures, a cross-level mentorship program." He said it plainly, without the energy of a man wanting credit. Gerald resigned, partly in response to the review, partly for other reasons. I don't think he and I were ever going to agree about what the firm was for. "And Rosalind?" "She stayed. She's been—" He paused. "She's been more reasonable than I expected, once she understood I wasn't backing down. I think she'd been waiting for someone to make that clearer for a long time and didn't know it." He paused again. "Or I'm giving her more credit than she deserves. I'm not entirely sure." She smiled at that. Not broadly, but genuinely. "Probably both," she said. "Probably both," he agreed. They reached the edge of the courtyard where it opened onto the embankment path along the river. The late September sun was doing its best over the Thames, that particular low London gold that makes you understand why people have been painting this city for centuries. They stopped at the railing and stood with the water below them for a moment, the fair going on behind them and the city spreading out on both sides. "I owe you something I haven't fully said yet," Nathan said. She looked at him. "Not an apology, I've done that. What I owe you is, he stopped, an acknowledgement that isn't about the firm or the coverage or what I've changed or what I'm doing differently. Just, he was choosing his words with unusual care, the way people do when they're trying to say something true rather than something that sounds good. You were excellent at what you did, genuinely excellent, in ways I was too incurious to register. Not the humanitarian work, that too, obviously, but the actual work of those 6 years. The errors you caught, the meetings you prepared, the correspondence you managed that kept relationships intact that I would have let deteriorate through inattention. You did that work every day with complete professionalism and without the acknowledgement it deserved, and I was the person responsible for that acknowledgement, and I failed at it completely. He looked at the water. I just wanted to say that, separately from everything else. The ordinary work you did was extraordinary, and I should have said so years ago. She was quiet for a moment. She had not expected that. She had expected, without fully knowing she was expecting it, something about the bigger story. The Brussels years, the Geneva report, the life he hadn't known about. The version of her that had turned a room silent at the Dorchester. She had not expected him to name the smaller version, the sticky notes, the correspondence, the coffee at exactly the right temperature. She had not expected to be moved by that, and she was, and she let herself be, because she had made a decision somewhere in the Amsterdam months to stop treating her own feelings as things that required management before she allowed them. Thank you, she said, not deflecting it, not minimizing it, just receiving it cleanly, the way you receive something you actually needed without apologizing for having needed it. They stood at the river for another few minutes, not talking much. The city did what it always did, which was proceed without reference to individual moments of human reckoning, and they let it. Coffee, he said eventually. Occasionally. You offered. Before. The offer still stand? It still stands, she said. No agenda? No agenda. He nodded once, and the relief in it was the modest, durable kind. Not the relief of a resolved crisis, but the relief of a door that hasn't closed. She left the book fair with 2 novels and an essay collection she'd bought partly because the cover was beautiful, and partly because the title, The Discipline of Noticing, had made her stop and put money on the table without reading the back. She took the bus along the embankment with the September light going gold over the water and let herself think about the shape of the last year. There was a version of this story that wanted to be a redemption arc. Hers, or Nathan's, or both. The version where the humiliation at the Gala was the inciting wound and everything that followed was the healing of it. The version where the ending was clean. The powerful man sufficiently changed, the overlooked woman sufficiently vindicated, the lesson sufficiently learned, everyone standing in the earned light of growth. She didn't fully trust that version, not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. Redemption was real, and change was real, and growth was real. She had seen evidence of all 3 in the last 12 months, in Nathan, in herself, in Portia Ashby's uncomfortable honesty, and Gerald Fitch's reluctant nod, and even, she suspected, in Marcus Hale, sitting somewhere in the city with his discomfort and whatever he chose to do with it. Those things were not nothing, but they didn't erase the 6 years. They didn't cancel the morning she'd stood in the kitchenette and listened to people laugh about her over her own lunch. They didn't undo the hundreds of mornings she had walked onto that floor and made herself smaller than she was because it was easier than the cost of being visible. Those years were hers, and they had cost her something real, and no subsequent development required her to retroactively reframe them as necessary stepping stones. They were what they were. They had been wrong. She had survived them. She had slowly and imperfectly come out the other side into something that felt like herself. That was the actual story. Not the glamorous version, not the arc where the villain is punished and the hero is restored. The quieter version where a woman figures out, at 39, that she has been complicit in her own invisibility for long enough, and begins, without fanfare and without a clean arrival, the work of stopping. The bus crossed Waterloo Bridge in London, spread out on both sides, enormous and indifferent and full of lives at every window, every one of them carrying its own invisible weight, its own private history of being seen or unseen, its own ongoing negotiations between what was offered and what was deserved. She thought about Sophie in the Amsterdam office, staying too late and needing to be told to go home, and she thought about the 26-year-old version of herself who had flown to Brussels on her own money because she'd read about a program in a newsletter and decided it mattered. She thought about the Copenhagen photograph in the back of her desk drawer, the one she now had on her windowsill at home, the one where she was half out of frame and laughing. She thought about what it meant to spend years of your life on work that changed other people's circumstances, and how that work had its own kind of cost, and how the cost didn't make the work wrong. It just made it something you had to approach with honesty about what you could sustain and what you couldn't. She was working on that. She was, for the first time in years, actually working on that rather than working on everything else, and hoping the rest would take care of itself. The bus reached her stop. She got off. The evening was the particular London blue of late September, the sky not quite dark and not quite light, the street lamps beginning to come on with the slightly apologetic quality of lights that know they're not yet strictly necessary. She walked home slowly, which she hadn't let herself do in a long time, walked and looked at the city, the ordinary, extraordinary texture of it, the restaurants going orange with dinner service, the people on phones, the couple arguing quietly on a corner, the small children being carried by parents who had the specific expression of people running on less sleep than they needed. She stopped at a small grocery near her building and bought things for an actual dinner, which she cooked when she got home and ate at her table rather than over the sink, which had been her habit for more years than she wanted to count. She opened the essay collection she'd bought at the fair. The first piece was about the practice of attention, how the decision to look carefully at the world was not a passive thing, but an active one, something that had to be renewed constantly, because the default setting of a busy life was inattention. She read for an hour. She made a second cup of tea and drank it while it was still hot. She looked at the Copenhagen photograph on her windowsill, the half-out-of-frame, thin-coated, laughing version of herself, and she held it with the complicated warmth that she was learning to have for her own past. Not nostalgia, not regret, not the wincing distance of someone trying not to look, but the steady gaze of a person who could look at where they'd been without needing it to have been different. She set the photograph back on the windowsill. Outside, London continued in the way London continued, vast and old and full of people carrying things, getting it wrong and right, in alternating and unglamorous succession, trying in the ways they could manage, failing in the ways they couldn't yet avoid, moving through their lives with the ordinary human combination of intention and accident that no story about any of them could fully capture. She was part of it, specifically, imperfectly, on her own terms, part of it. She did not need anyone's invitation to know that. She had known it a long time. She just needed, finally, to stop pretending she hadn't. That was the work. Not the Brussels work or the Amsterdam work or the Sterling and Vale work. The actual work. The daily, undramatic, unfinished work of a person taking herself seriously. She was doing it. That was enough. It was at last exactly enough.